All right, greetings and welcome. We hear the tink. That means that we are live. Greetings and welcome back. This is the LEV project. We took a few days to just process everything. This information could definitely be heavy at times. But again, I looked at the date. It's the 24th. So we're going to double up. Um, we're going to double up on the reading so that we can make sure we finish this particular text by the end of the month and start on another one in the beginning of the month. So I want to thank all those who have stuck with us so far. We're more than halfway through the book. I'm just uploading at this point, or sharing. Let me just say that for those who want to join us in live. We're just gonna keep going. I don't know if anyone has saw or probably have the whole controversy. I made a little video on it. Sometimes I just like to look and listen, before I say anything, and listening to the reasoning of people, and I'm like, okay, we're all up in arms about the comments that are made. Do we even need a Black History Month, quote unquote Black History? And what are we doing about it? We don't have to wait for approval to learn your history. You don't have to beg anyone to learn your history. You can just do like what we're doing. We started on the 1st of January and we're going through it together. Questions or comments that we may have, and that's pretty much it. You teach the children the stuff that is appropriate for children to hear and understand, and we go from there. So, coming out of the looking or the desire for approval from others, and basically invest that time and energy that you or we expect others to invest. It's like they need to know, but we need to know. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. Um, and all it takes is a little bit of a desire and just to do it. So that being said, we're going to do chapter 12 now, and then we're going to do chapter 13 later today at 9 o'clock, because it's nap time here at the ranch. So I got to get it in when it's quiet. So we're going to do that nap time, which is at 1 o'clock. And if you're listening to this on the replay, thanks for those who stop by on the replay every time. And it's a blessing. So we're going to start now. And for those who've just joined us, like I said, we're going to do chapter 12 right now, and we're going to do 13. And so going forward to the end of the month, we're just going to double up, because this book has 20 chapters. So we'll double up just to make sure that we'll be finished by the end of the month. And so chapter 12, once again, I'm still looking for a man volunteers. I had a few volunteers in the beginning, and then it dwindled off. And this is the kind of stuff that we will need to look at within ourselves. Do we care beyond the beginning, and are we going to put that time and energy and that effort into it for what we're looking for? But nonetheless, the link is in the box if you would like to follow along. This is chapter 12. So after this, the fishing season passed. Wait a minute, let me recap. Last chapter, it was a whole ordeal. So if you missed that one, definitely hop back over and listen to it. He came off the plantation. The master sent him to the fishery now, and there's some fishy business going on. Let's just say that. So he escaped some real drama just now, and now we're going back into chapter 12. After this, the fishing season passed off without anything having happened worthy of being noticed here. When we left the fishery and returned to the plantation, which was after the middle of April, the corn and cotton had been planted, and the latter had been replanted. It was set to bow with 2 mules for my team, and having never been accustomed to plowing with these animals, I had much trouble with them at first. My master owned more than 40 mules, and at this season of the year, they were all at work in the cotton field, used instead of horses for drawing plows. Some of the largest were hitched to a single plow, but the smallest were coupled together. On the whole, the fishery had a losing affair with me. For although I have lived better at the landing than I usually did at the plantation, yet I had been compelled to work all the time, by night and by day, including Sunday, for my master, by which I had lost all that I could have earned for my own benefit, had I been on the plantation. I had now become so well acquainted with the rules of the plantation and the customs of the country where I lived that I experienced less distress than I did at my first coming to the South. We now receive a shod every Sunday evening with our peck of corn. The fish were those that I had caught in the spring and were tolerably preserved. In addition to all this, each of the hands now received a pint of vinegar each week. The vinegar was a great comfort to me. As the weather became hot, I gathered lettuce and other salads from my garden in the woods, which with the vinegar and bread furnished me many a cheerful meals. The vinegar had been furnished to us by our master more out of regard to our health than to our comfort, but it greatly promoted both. The affairs of the plantation now went on quietly until after the cotton had been plowed and hoed the first time after replanting. The working of the cotton crop is not disagreeable labor, no more so than the culture of corn. But we were called upon to perform a kind of labor than which none can be so toilsome to the body or dangerous to the health. I have elsewhere informed the reader that my master was a cultivator of rice as well as of cotton. Whilst I was at the fishery in the spring, 30 acres of swampland had been cleared off, plowed, and planted in rice. The water had now been turned off the plants, and the field was to be plowed and hoed. When we were taken to the rice field, the weather was very hot, and the ground was yet muddy and wet. The plows went to be dragged through the wet soil, and the young rice had to be cleaned of weeds by the hand and up killed up with the hoe. It is the common opinion that no stranger can work a week in a rice swamp at this season of the year without becoming sick. And all the new hands, 3 in number, besides myself, were taken ill within the first 5 days after have entered this field. The other 3 were removed to the sick room, but I did not go there, choosing rather to remain at the quarter where I was my own master, except that the doctor who called to see me took a large quantity of blood from my arm and compelled me to take a dose of some sort of medicine that made me very sick and caused me to vomit violently. This happened on the second day of my illness, and from this time I recovered slowly, but was not able to go to the field again for more than a week. Here it is but justice to my master to say that during all the times of my illness, someone came from the great house every day to inquire after me and to offer me some kind of light and cool refreshment. I might have gone to the sick room at any time if I had chosen to do so. An opinion generally prevails among the people of both colors that the drug copperas is very poisonous, and perhaps it may be so if taken in large quantities. But the circumstance that is used in medicine seems to forbid the notion of its poisonous quantities. I believe copperas was mingled with the portion of the doctor gave me. Some overseers keep copperas by them as a medicine to be administered to the hand whenever they become sick. But this I take to be a bad practice, for although in some cases this drug was very infectious, it certainly should be administered by a more skillful hand than that of an overseer. It, however, has the effect of deterring the people from complaining of illness until they are no longer able to work, for it is the most nauseous and sickening medicine that was ever taken into the stomach. Ignorant or malicious overseer may and often do misapply it, as was the case with our overseer when he compelled poor Lydia to take a draught of its solution. So they giving them medicine. They say they're sick. They give them medicine to make them really sick so that they will stop from saying that they're sick. Wow. After the restoration of my health, I resumed my accustomed labor in the land and continued it without intermission until I left this plantation. Uh-oh. We see some light at the end of the tunnel here. Let's see what's going to happen. We had this year a part of our crop, 10 acres of indigo. This plant is worked nearly after the manner of rice, except that it is planted on high and dry ground, while the rice is always cultivated in low swamps, where the ground may be inundated with water. But notwithstanding its location on dry ground, the culture of indigo is not less unpleasant than that of rice. When the rice is ripe and ready for the sickle, it is no longer desirable. But when the indigo is ripe and ready to cut, the trouble attendant upon it have only commenced. The indigo plant bears more resemblance to the weed called wild indigo, which is common in the woods of Pennsylvania, than to any other herb with which I am acquainted. The root of the indigo plant is long and slender, and emits a scent somewhat like that of parsley. From the root issues a single stem, straight, hard, slender, covered with a bark, a little crack on its surface of gray color towards the bottom, green in the middle, reddish at the extremity, and without the appearance of pith in the inside. The leaves range in pairs around the stalk, are on an oval form, smooth, soft to the touch, furrowed above and of a deep green on the other side. The upper parts of the plant are loaded with small flowers destitute of smell. Each flower changes into pod, enclosing the seed. For those who have just joined us, we are reading chapter 13. No, sorry, chapter 12 of 50 Years and Change. At 9 o'clock tonight, we will read chapter 13, so you can also tune in. We're going to double up to the end of the month so that we can finish up the book nice and strong. It says the plant thrives best in rich, moist soil. The seeds are black, very small, and sowed in straight drills. The crop requires very careful culture and must be kept free from every kind of weed and grass. It ripens within less than 3 months from the time it is sown. And when it begins to flower, the top is cut off. And as a flower appears, the plant is again pruned until the end of the season. Indigo impoverishes land more rapidly than any other crop, and the plant must be gathered in with great caution for the fear of shaking off the valuable farina that lies in the leaves. When gathered, it is thrown into a steep vat, a large tub filled with water. Here it undergoes a fermentation, which in 24 hours at furthest is completed. A cock is then turned to let the water run into the yeah, that's what he said. I thought he was talking about a cock is then turned to let the water run into the second tub called the mortar or pounding tub. The steeping vat is then cleaned. The fresh plants may be thrown in, and thus the work is continued without interruption. The water in the pounding tub is stirred with wooden buckets with holes in their bottoms for several days, and after the sediment contained in the water has settled to the bottom of the tub, the water is let off, and the sediment, which is the indigo of commerce, is gathered in bags and hung up to drain. It is afterwards pressed and laid away to dry in cakes, and then packed in chests for market. You see how much work, today we've lost the value of all of what it takes to, make different products. Interesting. Washing at the tubs is exceedingly unpleasant, both on account of the filth and the stench arising from the decomposition of the plants. In the early part of June, our shad that each one had been used to receive was withheld from us, and we no longer receive anything but the peck of corn and pint of vinegar. This circumstance in a community less severely disciplined than ours might have procured murmurs, but to us it was only announced by the fact of fish not being distributed to us on Sunday afternoon. This was considered a fortunate season for our people. There had been no exemplary punishment inflicted upon us for several months. We had escaped entirely upon the occasion of the stolen bags of cotton. Nothing less was to have been looked for on that occurrence than a general whipping of the whole gang. And if you missed the whole cotton debacle, you got to go back to, I think that was like chapter 10, where the whole thing in the cotton and what happened there. There was more or less of whippings amongst us every week. Frequently, one was flogged every evening, over and above the punishment that followed on each settlement day. But these chastisements, which seldom exceeded 10 or 20 lashes, was of little import. I was careful for my own part to conform to all the regulations of the plantation. When I no longer received my fish from the overseer, I found it necessary again to resort to my own expedient for the purpose of procuring something in the shape of animal food to add to my bread and greens. I had by this time become well acquainted with the woods and swamp for several miles round our plantation, and this being the season when turtles came upon the land to deposit their eggs, he just loved, he loved all kind of meat. I availed myself of it, and going out on Sunday morning, caught it in the course of the day by traveling cautiously around the edge of the swamps. 10 snapping turtles, 4 of which were very large. As I caught these creatures, I tied each one with hickory bark and hung it up to the bough of a tree so that I could come and carry it home at my leisure. I afterwards carried my turtles home and put them in a hole that I dug in the ground 4 or 5 feet deep, and secured the sides by driving small pieces of split timber into the ground, quite round the circumference of the hole, the upper ends of the timber standing out above the ground. Into this hole I poured water at pleasure and kept my turtles until I needed them. On the next morning, I again went to the swamp to search for turtles, but as the period of laying their eggs had nearly passed, I had poor success today. Only 2 turtles of the species called skill pots, a kind of large terrapin with a speckled back and red belly. This day, when I was 3 or 4 miles from home in a very solitary part of the swamps, I heard the sound of bells similar to those with wagoners placed on the shoulders of their horses. At first, the noise of the bells of this kind in a place where were so unexpected alarmed me, as I could not imagine who or what it was that was causing these bells to ring. I was standing near a pond of water and listening attentively. I thought the bells were moving in the woods and coming toward me. I therefore crouched down upon the ground under cover of a cluster of small bushes that were near me, and lay not free from desquitude, if I said that correctly. If I didn't, please forgive me, to await the near approach of these mysterious bells. Sometimes they were quite silent for a minute or more at time, and then again would jingle quick, but not loud. They were evidently approaching me, and at length I heard footsteps distinctively in the leaves, which day dry upon the ground. A feeling of horror seized me at this moment, for I now recollected that I was on the verge of the swamp, near with the vultures and the carrion crows had mangled the living bodies of the two murderers. And my terror was not abated when a moment after I came, sorry, when a moment after I saw come from behind a large tree the form of a brawny, famished looking black man, entirely naked, with his hair matted and shaggy, his eyes wild and rolling, and bearing over his head something in the form of an arch elevated 3 feet above his head, beneath the top of which was suspended the bells, 3 in number, whose sounds had first attracted my attention. He saw a butt naked, huge black man with bells all over his head. Okay. If you don't know what happened with the two men that they left in the woods to die, and that also was a wild part in this story. You want to just jump back a few chapters, and you will see what happened to Harvey and David, I believe his name was. Upon a closer examination of the frightful figure, I perceived that it wore a collar of iron about its neck, and a large padlock pendant from behind, and carried it in its hand a long staff with an iron spear in one end. The staff, like everything else belonging to the strange specter, was black. It slowly approached within 10 paces of me and stood still. The sun was now down, and the early twilight produced the gloom of heavy forest, in the midst of which I was. Added approached darkness to heighten my dismay. My heart was in my mouth. All the hairs on my head started from their sockets. I seemed to be rising from my hiding place into the open air in spite of myself, and gasped for breath. The black apparition moved past me, went to the water, and kneeled down. The forest echoed with the sound of bells, and their dreadful peals filled the deepest recesses of the swamps, as their bearer drank the water of the pond, in which I thought I heard his irons hiss when they came into contact with it. I felt confident that I was now in the immediate presence of an inhabitant of another and fiery world, who had been permitted to escape for a time from the place of torment and come to revisit the scene of his former crimes. I now gave his mind is going crazy here. He don't know what to think. I'm sorry. I now gave myself up for lost without other aid than my own, and began to pray aloud to heaven to protect me. It's the first time I'm really hearing him pray. At the sound of my voice and supposed evil, one appeared to be scarcely less alarmed than I was. He sprang to his feet and at a single bound rushed mid-deep into the water. Then turned he, besought me in a supplant and piteous tone of voice to have mercy upon him and not carry him back to his master. The suddenness with which we pass from the extreme of one passion to the utmost bounds of another is inconceivable, and must be assigned to the catalogue of unknown causes and effects, unless we suppose the human frame to be an involuntary machine, operated upon by surrounding objects, which give it different and contrary impulses. As a ball is driven to and fro by the battens of boys when they play in the troops upon a common, I had no sooner heard a human voice than all my fear fled as a spark that ascended from the heap of a burning charcoal and vanishes to nothing. I at once perceived that the object that had well nigh deprived me of my reason, so far from having either the will or the power to enjoy me, was only a poor, destitute African Negro, still more wretched and helpless than myself. Rising from the bushes, I now advanced to the waterside and desired him to come out without fear, and to be assured that if I could render him any assistance, I would do it most cheerfully. As to carrying him back to his master, I was more ready to ask help to deliver me from my own than to give aid to anyone in forcing him back to his. We now went to a place in the forest where the ground was for some distance clear of trees, and where the light of the sun was yet so strong that every object could be seen. My new friend now desired me to look at his back, which was seamed and rigid with scars of whip and the hickory, from the pole of his neck to the lower extremity of the spine. The natural color of the skin had disappeared and was succeeded by a streaked and speckled appearance of dusty white and pale flesh color, scarcely any of the original black remaining. The skin of this man's back had been again and again cut away by the thong and renewed by the hand of nature until it was grown fast to the flesh and felt hard and turbid. He told me his name was Paul, and he was a native of Congo in Africa, that he had left an aged mother, a widow at home, as also a wife and 4 children, that it had been his misfortune to fall into the hands of a master who was frequently drunk, and whose temper was so savage that his chief delight appeared to consist in whipping and torturing his slaves, of whom he owned nearly 20. But through some uncomfortable caprice, he had contracted a particular dislike against Paul, whose life he now declared to me was insupportable. He had been wandering in the woods more than 3 weeks with no other substance than land turtles, frogs, and other reptiles that had been taken in the woods, and along the shores of the ponds with the aid of his spear. He had now been able to take, he had not been able to take any of the turtles in the laying season because the noise of his bell frightened them, and they always escaped to the water before he could catch them. He found many eggs which he had eaten raw, having no fire, nor any means of making fire to cook his food. He had been afraid to travel much in the middle of the day, lest the sound of the bells should be heard by one, and would make his master acquainted with the place of his concealment. The only periods when he ventured to go in search of food were early in the morning, before people could have time to leave their homes and reach the swamp, or late in the evening after those who were in pursuit of him had gone to their dwellings for the night. This man spoke our language imperfectly, but possessed a sound and vigorous understanding, and reasoned with me upon the propriety of destroying a life which was doomed to continual distress. He informed me that he had first run away from his master more than 2 years ago, after being whipped with a long hickory switch until he fainted, that he concealed himself in a swamp at that time, 10 or 15 miles from the place, for more than 6 months, but was finally betrayed by a woman who he had sometimes visited, that when taken, he was again whipped until he was not able to stand, and had a heavy block of wood chained to one foot, which he was obliged to drag after him at his daily labor for more than 3 months. When he found an old pile, which he cut the irons from his, when he found the old file, which he had cut the irons from his ankle, and again escaped to the woods, but was retaken within more than a week after his flight by 2 men who were looking after their cattle, and came upon him in the woods where he was asleep. On being returned to his master, he was again whipped, and then the iron collar that he now wore, with the iron rod extended from one shoulder over his head to the other, with the bells fastened at the top of the arch, were put upon him. Of these irons he could not divest himself, and wore them constantly from that time to the present. I had no instruments with me to enable me to release Paul from his manacles, and all I could do for him was to desire him to go with me to the place where I had left my turpins, which I gave to him. Together with the eggs that I found today, I also caused him to lie down and have furnished myself with a flint stone, many of which lay in the sand near the edge of the pond, and a handful of dry moss. I succeeded in striking fire for the iron collar, and made a fire of sticks upon which he could roast the turpins and the eggs. It was now quite dark, and I was 2 miles from my road, with no path to guide me towards home, but the small traces made in the woods by the cattle. I advised Paul to bear his misfortune as he could until the next Sunday, when I would return and bring with me a file and other things necessary to remove of his fetters. I now set out alone to my way home, not without some little feeling of trepidation, as I passed along in dark shade of pine trees and thought of terrific deeds that had been done in these woods. This was the period of the full moon, which now rose and cast her brilliant rays to the top of the trees and overhung my way, and enveloped my path in a gloom more cheerless than the obscurity of total darkness. The path I traveled led my, what is this? Sinuosities around the margin of the swamp, and finally ended at the extremity of the cart road, terminating at the spot where David and Hardy had been given alive for food to vultures, which was a wild, crazy experience. Reading that, and over this ground I was now obliged to pass unless I chose to turn far to the left through the pathless forest and make my way to the high road near the spot where the lady had been torn from her house. I hated the idea of acknowledging to my own heart that I was a coward and dared not look upon the bones of murderers at midnight. And there was a little less of awe attached to the notion of visiting the ground where the ghost of the murdered woman was reported to wander in the moonbeams. Then I visited the scene where diabolical crimes have been visited by fiend-like punishment. He don't know which way to go now, because he's afraid of their ghosts. He's afraid of what's if they're still walking around in this place. My opinion is that there is no one who is not at times subject to a sensation approaching fear when placed in situations similar to that in which I found myself this night. I did not believe that those who had passed the dark line which separates the living from the dead could again return to the earth, even for good or for evil. But that solemn forbearing of the heart which directs the mind of all men to contemplation of the just judgment with a superior and unknown power holds in reservation for the deed of this life, filled my soul with a dread conception of the unutterable woes with a righteous and unerring tribunal must award to the bloodstained spirits of the two men whose lives had been closed in such an unspeakable torment by the side of the path I was now treading. If you're not sure, the guys who they caught, the slave masters and the surrounding people, decided that they were going to let them tie them up naked and string them out alive, and then allow the crows and the animals to pick them while they're living until they died. And so he was aware of that punishment, and that's what he's contemplating at this point, if he wants to even walk by there, because chances are their bones are still there. It said the moon had risen high above the trees and shone with a clear and cloudless light. The whole firmament of heaven was radiant with the luster of a mild and balmy summer evening, save only the drops of the early dew from the lofty branches of the trees into the water, which lay in shallow pools on my right, and the light trampling on my own footsteps. The stillness of night pervaded the lonely waste around me. But there is a deep melancholy in the sound of the heavy drop as it meets the bosom of the wave in a dense forest at night, that revives in the memory the recollection of days of other years and fill the heart with sadness. For those who just joined us, we're reading chapter 12 of 12 years, but even chapter 12 of 50 years in chains. I was now approaching the unhallowed ground where they lay the remains of the remorseless and guilty dead, who had gone to their final account, reeking in their sins in a tone unblessed and unwept. Already I saw the bones, whitened by the rain and bleached in the sun, lying scattered and dispersed, a leg here and an arm there, while a skull with the underjaw in its place, man, they picked it clean, retaining all its teeth, grinned a ghastly laugh, with its front full in the beams of the moon, which falling into the vacant sockets of the eyeballs reflected a pale shadow from the deserted caverns and played in twinkling luster upon the bald and skinless forehead. In a moment, the night breeze agitated the leaves of the wood and moaned in dreary sighs through the lofty pine tops. The gale shook the forest in the depth of its solitude. A cloud swept across the moon and her light disappeared. A flock of carrion crows distributed in their roosts flapped their wings and fluttered over my head, and a wolf who had been gnawing the dry bones greeted the darkness with a long and dismal howl. Man, look, dude, know he wants to run. I felt the blood chill in my bones. Sorry, I felt the blood chill in my veins, and all my joints shuddered as if I had been smitten by electricity. At least a minute elapsed before I recovered the power of my self-government. I hastened to fly from a place devoted to crime, where an evil genius presided in darkness over a fell assembly of howling wolves and blood-snuffing vultures. When I arrived at the quarter, all was quiet. The inhabitants of this mock village were wrapped in forgetfulness. Sorry about that noise. And I stole silently into my little loft and joined my neighbors in their repose. Experience had made me so well acquainted with the dangers that beset the life of a slave that I determined as a matter of prudence to say nothing to anyone of the adventures of this Sunday, but went to work on Monday morning at the summons of the overseer's horn, as if nothing unusual had occurred. In the course of the week, I often thought of the forlorn and despondent African who had so terrified me in the woods and who seemed so grateful for the succor I gave to him. I felt anxious to become better acquainted with this man who possessed knowledge superior to this common race of slaves and manifested a moral courage in the conversation that I had with him, worthy of a better fate than to which fortune had consigned him. On the following Sunday, having provided myself with a large file, which I procured from the blacksmith shop belonging to the plantation, I again repaired to the place at the side of the swamp where I had been first seeing the figure of the ill-fated man. I expected that he would be in waiting for me at the appointed place, as I had promised him that I would certainly come again at this time. But on arriving at the spot where I left him, I saw no sign of any person. The remains of the fire I had kindled were here, and it seemed that the fire had been kept up for several days, but the quantity of ashes that lie in heap, surrounded by numerous small brands, the impression of human feet were quickly disposed around the decayed fire, and bones of terrapins that I had given to Paul, as well as the skeletons of many frogs, were scattered upon the ground. But there was nothing that showed that anyone had visited the spot since the fall of the last rain, which I now recollected had taken place in the previous Thursday. From this circumstance, I concluded that Paul had relieved himself of his irons and gone to seek concealment in some other place, or that his master had discovered his retreat and carried him back to the plantation. While standing at the ashes, I heard the croaking of ravens at some distance in the woods, and immediately afterwards a turkey buzzard passed over me, pursued by an eagle, coming from the quarter in which I had just heard the ravens. I knew that the eagle never pursued the buzzard for the purpose of preying upon him, but only to compel him to disgorge himself of his own prey for the benefit of the king of birds. I therefore concluded that there was some dead animal. Oh no. Okay, sorry. I therefore concluded that there was some dead animal in my neighborhood that had called all of these ravenous fowls together. It might be that Paul had killed a cow by knocking her down with a pine knot. He has a wild imagination, and he had removed his residence in his slaughtered animal. Curiosity was aroused in me, and I proceeded to examine the woods. I had not advanced more than 200 yards when I felt oppressed by a most sickening stench, and saw the trees swarm with birds of prey, buzzards perching upon their branches, ravens sailing amongst their boughs, and clouds of carrion crows flitting about and poising themselves in the air of the stationary position, after the manner of the most nauseous of all birds when it perceives or thinks it perceives some object of prey. Proceeding onward, I came in view of a large sassafras tree, around the top of which was congregated a cloud of crows, some of the boughs and others on the wing. With numerous buzzards were sailing low and nearly skimming the ground. This sassafras tree had many low horizontal branches attached to one, of which I now saw the cause of so vast an assembly of the unseen fowls of the air. The lifeless and putrid body of the unhappy Paul hung suspended by a cord made of twisted hickory bark, passed in the form of a halter round the neck, and firmly bound to the limb of the tree. It was, sorry, it was manifest that he had climbed the tree, fastened the cord to the branch, and then sprung off. The smell that assailed my nostrils was too overwhelming to permit me to remain long in view of the dead body, which was much mangled and torn, though its identity was beyond question, for the iron collar and the bells with the ark that bore them were still in their place. The bells had preserved the corpse from being devoured, for whilst I look at it, I observed a crow descended upon it and make a stroke at his face with its beak. But the motion that this gave to the bells caused them to rattle, and the bird took flight. Seeing that I could no longer render assistance to Paul, who was now beyond the reach of his master's tyranny, as well as of my pity, I returned without delay to my master's house, and going into the kitchen, related to the house slaves that I had found a black man hung in the woods with bells upon him. This intelligence was soon communicated to my master, who sent for me to come into the house to relate the circumstance to him. I was careful not to tell that I had seen Paul before his death, and when I had finished my narrative, my master observed to a gentleman who was with him that this was a heavy loss to the owner, and told me to go. The body of Paul was never taken down, but remained hanging where I had seen it until the flesh fell from the bones or was torn off by the birds. I saw the bones hanging in the sassafras tree more than 2 months afterwards, and the last time that I was ever in these swamps. That is wow. That's the end of chapter 12. That's a heavy end right there. Thank you all for just joining us. We're going to read chapter 13 later on tonight at 9 o'clock. So definitely tune in for that. That was a heavy chapter. You know, he saw the guy in the woods. The story is long, so if you missed any parts, but definitely go back. But it's just, I don't even know what to say right now. But I just want to say thank everybody for joining us. This is the LEV Project, where we're going over the narratives of our foreparents in this country. There's so many narratives throughout the Caribbean, South America, North America. And so right now we're just concentrating. This one is, he originated in Maryland. I'll just do a little recap. He originated in Maryland. He was stole away from his family and sold down south. And there he's worked on the plantation, and he's relating his story where he's seeing what's happening, the way people, it's just weird that you get used to, and the way he's saying it in the story, they get used to being beat. They get used to living in the life that they're living, and they rejoice when they don't get beat. And he went to actually kind of help Paul, who he met the week before, but he didn't get there in time, and it seems like he couldn't take it anymore. Paul was a freeborn African, it says, and he ran away so many times that his back was unrecognizable. That's just wild. So I don't see any, if you have anything to say, just hit me up on social media. Sometimes, it's heavy. So just hit me up on social media, put your questions or comments in the box. And if you would like to read at 9 o'clock, feel free to tell us, and that could work too. But until next time, I'm just going to Salah. I'm just going to peace on that one until we come back again, because some of this stuff we got to process for real, for real. It's not Mary had a little lamb. Some of the stuff you got to process. So definitely, if you want to talk, feel free. We're here. And once again, my name is Amuni Yisrael, and thank you for joining us. This is the LEV Project, Lift Every Voice. So we hope to hear your voices and reading and giving life and working through the healing process of understanding what happened to our foreparents, and how it affects us even on to this day. So until next time, actually next time is 9 o'clock. So see you later. Shalom.